How's it going? Welcome back to DylanPickups.com. So one of the things we want to talk about today is the resonant peak of a pickup, and actually of the entire guitar circuit, because it's kind of more than just the pickup. One of the things it's come up a lot on the YouTube channel lately. People have been asking the question, and actually on Facebook today. What does this all mean to how we pick what we pick for a guitar, and is it a big deal? We know that there are some main measurements of pickup performance, or statistic, or measurements, if you will. The DC resistance is probably the most used and maybe overused one, which is basically kind of a loose way of saying how many winds are on it, right? We've discussed this many times, that the DC resistance is not the only measurement. Inductance, the efficiency of the coil, we've discussed this measurement also, and the overall ability of the coil to induce a voltage. And we've also discussed capacitance, which has to do with within the coil, as the frequencies travel through the coil, or as the voltage travels through the coil, how things get stolen from one another because of capacitive loss, because of the wire used and the thickness and the insulation and that sort of stuff. So what we want to talk about today is kind of the culmination of all of those things put together, and what it ends up with is the resonant peak of the pickup. What does that mean? Well, first of all, everything in the world has a resonant frequency, which means if you have an object here and you have a different object here, and you vibrate object A at a particular frequency that matches object B, then they will both vibrate. You can actually make the other one vibrate, okay? And every object has a resonant peak, which means that that is the easiest frequency for that thing to vibrate at, basically, is really what it comes down to. So that being said, every pickup, the culmination of all the numbers that we've talked about and all the measurements that you can take about this pickup, are the resonant peak of that pickup, which means this is the frequency that it most easily can duplicate from the vibration of the strings. Okay? So what that looks like on a piece of paper is this. Something very similar to this. It's, well, I'm just gonna, kind of looks a little bit like that, okay? Because every pickup does not, they don't make all frequencies exactly the same all the way across the board. There is a range of frequencies that's much easier for this particular pickup, whatever it is. Remember, this is the culmination of all the other measurements. So your capacitance, your inductance, your resistance, the magnet strength, all this stuff comes down to this overall frequency that it is easiest for it to duplicate, okay? And we're not going to talk about what pickups do what, because every one is different. And since so few pickup manufacturers actually publicize this information, it's really more important to understand how this works because of the rest of our guitar circuit. Because there are very few people that just use the pickup with no tone knobs, with no volume, and no pedals or anything. So the thing is that if we introduce other resistances outside of the pickup, because this came up on YouTube, someone asked me or made the statement that they said putting a 250K pot or a 500K pot in a circuit with the pickup will change the resonant frequency of the pickup. No, it won't. Because the resonant frequency of the pickup is fixed based on the factors that we discussed earlier, because it's a coil with a magnet made out of certain diameter of stuff. That thing is no moving parts. It's the thing, okay? However, It does change. He was kind of right in the respect that we have to look at the whole circuit of the guitar and what it does together, because we change what the pickup can do based on what we put in front of it or behind it. Okay, so the pickup by itself with nothing else, the resonant frequency of that pickup does not change. However, if we put something in front of it or behind it, because the way resistance and capacitance work, it pulls on it, okay? So let me show you that. I'm going to use a different color. So if we put a different resistive load, meaning let's say a 250K pot versus a 500K pot, here's what happens. And I'm not going to do this relative to each other. I'm just going to show you what happens when you take a resistive load and introduce it to a pickup, okay? It goes something like this. It basically pulls down that resonant peak. It pulls it down. And this is why in our videos about selecting pots, we discuss the difference between using a 250K pot or a 500K pot, because the higher resistance, the further the amplitude of that resonant peak gets pulled down, okay? So that's resistance. Now, so that would be like if you put a pot in the circuit. Now, here's the interesting thing. If we put a capacitor in the circuit, something different happens. If this is higher frequencies going this way, and this is lower frequencies going this way, and we have this resonant peak here, and we put a capacitor in it, then what it does is it actually pulls the resonant peak this way. It actually moves it along towards lower frequencies, higher frequencies being over here. Okay, so when we change our capacitor, we put a capacitive load into the circuit, it moves it this way. Now, if we were to put a capacitive load and a resistor in there, so a capacitor and a tone knob, volume pot, then it would possibly end up somewhere in this neighborhood. Now, I'm just making these up. This is not obviously mathematically correct, my drawing, but I just wanted to illustrate the point to you that with resistive load to a circuit, the amplitude of the resonant peak goes down. With a capacitive load to the circuit, the resonant peak of the frequency changes from right to left depending on that capacitive load. So, what does this mean? Well, this is very interesting because there's a couple of things. Now that we understand how it works, moves on the graph, when we pull all the components away and we just look at the pickup by itself, that would mean that a higher resistance pickup or a higher capacitance pickup would have a different resonant peak along the lower to higher frequency range. So that's how it changes. It almost, what you're doing within the pickup before you add any knobs is how it changes that. The capacitive load and the resistive load of the pickup changes along this graph. And then we establish that baseline. That curve doesn't move. And then we add a resistor, a pot, and we add a capacitor, a tone circuit, and we can vary that all the way around. Now, here's the interesting part about this, though. If we go back to our drawing and we look at our baseline resonant peak of our pickup, remember, this is the easiest frequency for this pickup to make. It's not the only pickup or only frequency that it can make, it's the easiest. The thing is let's say, so if it's here, that doesn't mean that that's where we play all the time. We're all over the place. So this is something that you hear me preaching about this all the time, that we don't play in a lab. It's almost, I don't want to say it's pointless, because it does give you sort of a baseline. But don't get super, super hung up on what the resonant peak of a particular pickup is. And don't get hung up on any number. You got to go by your ear, because you play differently than I play. The pedal that you put in front of this thing changes the load, which is different than the pedal that I use. The amp that you use is different than I use. The way you play and how your hands introduce frequencies to and harmonics to the pickup changes. This thing is moving around all the time. This is not a fixed lump on a line like this is. It's moving all over the place. Now, if this pickup, it's very easy for it to make a frequency that you don't like, and you're constantly playing across that frequency and it's harsh on your ears, then it's time to change something. But does that mean you have to change the pickup? I hope so, because that's what I do. But not always. Maybe it's you change the cap. Maybe it's you change the value of your tone pot or your volume pot. Maybe it's because you could put I even hate to say this, but maybe you could put a tone bleed circuit. I don't like them. But maybe you could put a tone bleed circuit in there and it would change it. There's a lot of things you can do to change the resistance on the front end or the back end of the circuit, change the overall capacitance of the overall circuit to get this curve where you want it so that you're not going across this resonant peak that you don't like to your ears. Now that being said, many times those frequencies, sometimes they're right in the sweet spot, right? Like that's the one where you hit the note and it just goes and the sustain is perfect and you're like, you know what, this is the right pickup, because it's very easy for that pickup, and more importantly, the entire composite circuit, to make the frequency that my ear likes to hear. So that's really it. The resonant peak of a pickup, just the pickup, if we go back down to our drawing, this blue line right here is the frequency that it is easiest for that pickup to duplicate. Once we start to add resistance to our circuit, we then affect that line right there. And as we end up adding capacitance to our circuit, then we end up affecting this line right here. And that's really all there is to it. Do we need to get hung up on any one number? No, because it's all a system and it all works together. But what it helps us to understand is that there is a difference between a 250K pot load and a 500K. And remember that there's two of them, right? Or four of them. Anytime you add something to a circuit outside of just the pickup by itself, you are adding a resistive load. And if it's a capacitor, like there's two of them, depending on how it's wired, you can add a capacitive load also. So anytime you change that anytime you add a component to the system, you are going to change the overall resonant frequency of the resonant peak of that circuit. Not just the pickup itself, but the whole circuit. Okay? So just think about that, and that'll help you to realize that probably less is better sometimes. And you know, the less you do to it, the less you introduce to it is better. At least that's kind of the way I like to think of it anyway. It's not necessarily a rule, but I don't speak to those sort of rules. But for me, less is more kind of when it comes to that, because I don't like to clamp down anything at least as possible. There you go. Resonant peak of a pickup. It's the easiest frequency for it to make. Here's how you can affect it. Resistance and capacitance. See what you think, see how it feels with your guitar, figure out what you want to change, comment below, and please follow this blog, because you know we're going to talk more and more about this stuff. If this brings up other questions, definitely shoot us a message. Dylan Pickups, dylanpickups.com, and Dylan Pickups on YouTube, and of course the Dylan Talks Tone is our blog. So I hope you all have a great day. Please subscribe and tell all your friends about us, and we will see you next time.